So we met through my sister.
That's right.
So shout out to Katie Stehura.
Big shout out to Katie.
Yeah, this wouldn't have happened without her. And you two used to dance together for a while, right?
That's right. Right before I became a psychotherapist, I was a dancer, and Katie and I connected through one of my very first projects of when I returned back to New York after living in Salt Lake City, dancing there for 2 years. So,
Okay.
so Katie was part of my new wave of dance friends as I reintegrated back into the New York City dance scene.
Love it.
Yeah,
Love it.
and we're still friends to this day, and it was really nice to connect
Yeah.
with you through her.
It was so funny because she was just like, you should totally meet Andrea. Like, you guys are both, I think she said, like, you guys are both nerds or something like that. I was like,
yeah, totally.
And so, yeah, we all
Philosophy,
hung out and we were just
interests.
like, all right. And then, yeah, we were kind of thinking of different pieces to do for this. And we were kind of thinking about different things involving death, just because of kind of the symbolic nature of, like, Halloween just passed, fall, autumn is a lot of times associated with end of life. And,
Right. And yeah, if we want to bring some context to time and place, right? It's also Scorpio season, just every year. Halloween signals that. And if you celebrate Halloween in the traditional sense, it's really a homage to this season that is all about death, all about the taboo, all about deep psychological dives and study of things that are not mainstream, like the occult, but also and then sex falls into that category, especially Scorpios. If you read any Cosmo, is always associated with sex, so that's a big tie-in. And of course, that's the nature of any polarity. When you have death, you're also comparing it to life, and the erotic is a way of feeling aliveness, and sometimes, like, we feel our aliveness most when we are recognizing death and our own mortality.
Yeah, I love that. And thinking about it as, like, kind of two sides of the same coin. And there's actually, and we'll get to it when we kind of get into the book, but throughout this book on death and dying, each chapter begins with a little quote by an Indian philosopher, Tagore. I'm not sure how it's pronounced. Tagore. This was in the last chapter. Death belongs to life as birth does. The walk is in the raising of the foot as in the laying of it down.
So good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was even thinking, like, so they're saying, death is a part of life. You could also, or like a part of birth. You can also think of, like, birth as a part of death.
Yes.
As well.
Right. Well, in Jungian psychology, we would call this a threshold experience. Death is a portal. It's seen as a threshold crossing, just like birth is. And birth, you are crossing from the threshold. You're crossing over the threshold from the womb world into the life world as you embark on this journey being human, and the hero's journey of fulfilling your life purpose and all of that.
That's so great. It made me think of Otto Rank has a book. I haven't read it, but the book is about kind of the hero's journey that begins from the time we're kind of conceived to the time we're born. And that, like, even just that is its own kind of hero's journey. And that by the time we are born, we've already kind of undergone a lot.
Yeah. And I think when we're talking about, just to come back to the reasons why we seasonally need to reconfront death at this time of year, is as human beings, we always kind of put our own mortality to the back burner, to the backs of our minds. It's a functional thing, right? You can't really function well when you're always worried about when your impending doom will come.
Right.
And so it's a healthy denial, a healthy dissociation of away from our own mortality. But sometimes if we forget too well that mortality exists and that death exists, we become sort of in this hubris place thinking we're invincible. And
Yeah.
and it's just a moment ago I was mentioning the memento mori and before we started this podcast recording. And that's something that also comes from this culture of our I want to say international culture of having rituals to remember death and acknowledge death and respect death. And the memento mori is one that it's Latin, so it comes from Latin culture, as in the original Roman Empire. So it just means to remember that you can die, and you can have any kind of token that reminds you of that.
And this was news to me. Yeah, so you have a vulture.
I have my vulture here.
Right.
I actually keep it all year round out in my house, and that's my memento mori. Yeah.
Oh, okay, so it actually is. I thought you were just kind of saying that for today, but that this actually is kind of the function that it serves, is just this like reminder of your mortality. Yeah.
It means a lot of things to me. I also do, as a therapist, I practice internal family systems, which is kindly referred to as parts work. And one of my inner parts is actually a vulture. So that's how I took a liking to it, was in a way of befriending this part of me that in my own system just kind of exists as a spirit animal in the desert, and a reminder that abundance and plenty, and what you have could be taken away at any time. Yeah. And so there's anything is perishable and impermanent. It's a reminder of impermanence too, if we want to bring in some Buddhist philosophy. Right. So this part of me functions for me personally as a reminder of impermanence and a way to sort of detach from some of the things that I hold dear, as a reminder that, you might not have this one day. Yeah. And then because it's impermanent.
Well, you definitely won't have it one day.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And, right. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah.
And, because it's impermanent, that's the double-edged sword, or the two-sided coin of death and life. You know that it's impermanent. You know that death will happen. You know that an end will come. And so you can then even more appreciate the pleasure and the joy of having the things you have, and you have even more gratitude for it.
Right. You're kind of, it helps you to kind of stay present in the moment and appreciate things more.
Yeah. And that's the Scorpio season, right? The erotic and death being the two sides. That's why we have, scary movies. We get, or like going on a thrilling roller coaster, we get this near-death experience, either vicariously through the characters on the screen, or for our own body to feel what it would be like to fall to our death in a roller coaster. But it also, when we get out of that movie, that what the exhilaration and the adrenaline is also a reminder of how alive we still are, and that can be very exciting and arousing. So there's this, that's
well, then and it also made me think of like the French saying, like what is it, there's a French saying, maybe I'll put it in the show notes, but it basically translates to a tiny death. And it's describing an orgasm.
Yes.
So there is that, even like you said, the tie between eroticism and death is very intimate, and shows up in a lot of different ways.
Yeah. And so as we were talking and about to dive into this book, I think it's important.
Mort. That's what it is. Yeah.
La petite mort.
There we go. Yeah. Sorry, but you go ahead.
I'm so glad you brought that up. No, I did. That's so true. And so as we're about to dive into this book, which, right, as I was reading it, sometimes there were parts of me that were like, oh, this is depressing. It's a downer. But it's also, in a way, it can be very much a downer in terms of energy, but it does also remind us in a stoic way of how this is a fact of life, a fact of reality. Yeah. And sometimes that can inspire you to turn towards your life with a bit more vigor and vitality. And then when I talk about the erotic, I just want to be clear, I'm also speaking from Audrey Lorde's essay on the erotic is power. And, her description of the erotic is something that just lives within any facet of life. If you can turn yourself on to receive and attune to that vibrancy that's all around you, feeling joy and pleasure and aliveness in just touching the wood of your table, remembering that came from a tree, or like getting in touch with your senses of the temperature of the air on your skin. And there's always opportunities to feel alive and to find the erotic of the moment, even as we're slowly dying. So, and what I think, while this book specifically focuses on the terminally ill who have been given this label, this diagnosis of you are now slowly dying, or you are about to die a little more quicker, we're actually all in that boat. So it's it's just more imminent for some. And when you're much closer to that point, it brings all of these things to the forefront.
Well, and she says in this book, they're kind of forced to confront it. They're kind of given no choice but to confront it. And that, and she actually starts this book, the first chapter is called The Fear of Death. And she kind of talks about the cultural taboo around death nowadays and the fear and denial of death. And then kind of gives some kind of theories on why that might be the case. I was thinking that might be a kind of cool place to start.
I have so many thoughts on that.
So maybe I'll just read a few of these quotes up front to kind of frame this. All right. She says, when we look back in time and study old cultures and people, we are impressed that death has always been distasteful to man. So she's saying, we've always kind of had this distaste to death in any culture, any time in history, but she is kind of highlighting there's something significant about when she was writing this, which is in the 1960s. These kind of last couple decades, it seems like that fear and denial was like exponential. And the first thing she kind of attributes this to are advances in medicine. And I thought this was really fascinating. So she says, the more we're making advances in science, the more we seem to fear and deny the reality of death. And I think there's probably a couple reasons for this. So one that she mentions is infant mortality has just been so much more commonplace, pretty much any previous generation throughout history. Whereas in the last kind of 100 years, it's kind of an outlier to, either have a child or a sibling who passes away at a young age. Whereas at any other point in history, that was very common. So I can speak personally. I've been fortunate enough to experience very little death in my life. I mean, some grandparents, aunts and uncles, a few friends who took their life. But I would imagine that had I lived, 300 years ago, that number would be way, way higher.
It certainly would. There's a movie I love called Antonia's Line. And in that movie, there are I remember watching it the first time, and what really struck me was how often there was a character dying. And, just from a tractor accident or, childbirth. Someone did take their life in that movie. So there's, it's much more commonplace and prevalent, but it's true, right? Modern medicine has helped us avoid a lot of what could have been perilous situations and illnesses. And also at the same time, because of modern medicine, when we do have something that is potentially terminal, we do go into a setting, a hospital. We go into these places where the death experience is hidden away from public view, whereas death would happen out in public view much more frequently
or
in the
past.
Home. In the home, right? Exactly. So, to happen upon a relative or a friend who had died was just a lot more common. So then I think it's, in a way, we've become I don't know if desensitized is the word. It's just that it's kind of hidden even more.
Yeah.
It's hidden and it's so out of view. We just think of it as something that happens when you're old, happens in a nursing home, and it happens away, kind of like where trash goes. People are like, trash just goes away. And there's this very strong psychological separation from it.
Yeah, that's great. You brought up, the hospital, and she talks a lot about that as well, that, death is something that used to happen in the home and is now something that happens, kind of in closed doors in the hospital. And there's also a lot of other things that leads to, which one of them, which she kind of talks about throughout this whole book, is that at least in the 1960s when she was writing this, the patient was kind of viewed by the doctors more as just like a diagnosis or like a number rather than a human being. And there's this kind of cold, clinical, kind of detached relationship happening, which which I think she's saying kind of increased the sense of loneliness and isolation that a lot of terminally ill people experience, and a lot of elderly people, because that's another thing that, all the advances in medicine have made that process of dying a lot more gradual. And that there's just kind of these, we're thankful for the medicine. I don't think she's saying we don't want the medicine, but she is saying like all of these other kind of issues have kind of sprung from this, from these new advances. Right.
You're extending the dying process, right? Because there's life support. There's all of these ways that somebody can be kept alive much longer than what would have naturally happened.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you're speaking to the very like cold clinical treatment of such patients, almost like objects. That this person is now my Frankenstein experiment that I can try to keep alive if I can, and they get reduced to a heart that needs to be kept pumping, or lungs that need to be kept breathing, and they get reduced to these organs, or just a body as an object, and that kind of treatment, right, that dehumanizes the person, and it totally glosses over the emotional experience of death. And what was so revolutionary about her work, because this was, this is also like something that as I was mentioning before we started this podcast, is treated as the gold standard for grief work, grief counseling. And there's been, of course, a lot of advances since then of understanding that grief is not just a 5-stage process, that et cetera, but she was very, for her time, revolutionary in actually focusing on the feelings.
Yeah.
And
you get that sense from the book as well.
Yeah. And in that culture, like I'm thinking of the 1960s, it was like the jet set period and like going to the World's Fair and all these modern wonders and just like such a excitement for science and technology, which values logic and reason and rationality. And that's beautiful. And we need that. But she was bringing something that was, more emotional and so sorely needed, because as human beings, we're not just robots. We're not objects. We're not experiments. We have feelings, and this process is terrifying, and it actually brings up a lot of our, the inner children that are parts as well, that are, just helpless in the face of something beyond one's control, this process, this life process.
Absolutely. And, while we're kind of talking about this, how the patient is sometimes treated in a very cold, kind of calculated, detached way, she had an idea that basically the reason that some doctors are so cold and calculating and kind of impersonal, especially when they're doing something like telling somebody about their diagnosis, is as like their own protective mechanism.
100%.
And
yep.
I had never thought about this. She says, quote, "Sometimes the only way doctors are able to communicate such news is in a cool, detached way."
Right.
Yeah.
So you can have empathy and understanding for the people in proximity to the dying person in fact, the ironic thing about her work was that, she originally started the project as a way to develop a roadmap for the dying person in terms of how they could, have something to expect for their feelings and their stages, because you're facing a very unknown thing, and having something known somewhat is comforting, brings some relief. But it actually ended up being used more by the folks in grief and proximity to the dying person. So, so that as her project evolved, that's what she kind of discovered was, actually people who also need their feelings heard is the staff, the therapists, the helping profession, the health professionals that are involved,
the family,
right? So all of those individuals who are in proximity to the dying person are trying to manage their feelings of helplessness too, because they're also helpless to this process. And especially like in a medical profession, I mean, traditionally, you're in a role where you are, take an oath, a Hippocratic oath to do no harm and to always preserve life as much as possible. And so you get used to that role of being the hero that can save somebody from death. But when somebody is inevitably heading in that direction, it can create this sort of cognitive dissonance about your job and how effective you are as a doctor, as a medical professional.
Well, and she even mentioned sometimes the doctor or the nurse can feel anger towards the patient for dying on them. So there's that component of it too. I remember there's an episode of Scrubs where certain surgeons didn't want to operate on certain patients because they were likely to die under the surgery, and then that was going to decrease their numbers. And then that has all kinds of implications for what kind of jobs that they are able to get. So there's a lot, and I'm not saying that's the only reason they might feel anger towards the patient for dying. There might be other reasons as well, but
well, but that speaks to their and our everybody's illusion of having control over this thing, this false sense of control. Yes, we all have some degree of control in our lives, and at the same time, we're butting up with that agency and that free will against fate.
Yeah.
And it is fated that everyone will die.
Yeah.
And so that's sort of the helplessness, the feeling of not having control when you've gotten used to feeling like you do and that you can control this thing. And in fact, no, we're always in relationship to these greater forces.
Yeah, I think that's great, because once we start going through the stages, we'll kind of see how the dying person's lack of control is responsible for a lot of these feelings, the kind of anger, the kind of bargaining. What if I just do this? Then will I get to live? Still kind of clinging to that sense of control.
Definitely.
But maybe we can, I'm just going to give a quick summary of how this book kind of came to be, so that we kind of have some context. So Elisabeth Kubler-Ross, she's a Swiss psychiatrist, and she was working in a hospital in Manhattan with terminally ill patients in the 60s as a psychiatrist. And then she became the instructor at Chicago University in the Pritzker School of Medicine. I'm not sure how that's pronounced. And and then in 1965, 4 theology students from the theology seminary approached her about doing this research project where they would basically interview terminally ill patients and ask them a series of questions. First, just kind of general questions, and then more specific questions talking about their feelings around the process of dying, their feelings around death. And then they would obviously get the patient's consent. And then afterwards, the group would discuss the interview. And then the students at some later point would write research paper kind of talking about their impressions of it and whatnot. And it turned out to be quite a success. I guess it was met with a little bit of resistance at first from the hospital staff. I think they kind of felt like they were interfering a little bit.
Yeah, well, and they're being maybe judged, and there was like a critical eye put on their bedside manner.
Yeah.
This is their bedside manner that was being, on the line, presented on the line. And thanks to this work, actually, and I'm sure we can talk about this towards the end, but thanks to this work, she actually helped greatly improve the treatment of patients who are in palliative care and who are in this process of dying.
Yeah. And she also talks a little bit about at the end how many of the patients really responded well to this project, this interview project. She said less than 2% didn't want anything to do with it. So that's pretty crazy on its face, that 98% of people were willing and eager to be interviewed. And she gave a few theories of why this might have been the case. She thought, for one, maybe it fulfilled their need to kind of vent some of their anger and frustration about the hospital staff, or, the whole, just kind of an outlet for them.
Yes. Verbal ventilation.
Verbal ventilation, yeah.
She uses that term a lot.
You read in some of these interviews, the person is kind of, trashing the hospital or whatnot.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's half my job is just letting somebody express raw feelings that are, just candid of how they feel. And, without interruption, without judgment, just a free space to verbally ventilate all of that. And that is incredibly healing to just have a witness, because this is going back to like our whole like raison d'être and our sense of self. We need other people to validate our experience in order to feel like we really exist.
Yeah.
Like if the tree falls in a forest and no one's around to hear it, like doesn't make a sound, that whole quandary, that's really what we feel as human beings, is that, if I am feeling all these feelings inside, but no one's around to witness them and hear me speak them, am I real? Am I existing? Am I even a human being? And all of that is part of, especially if you're facing death, life review. You want to feel like your existence was worthy and or worthwhile and purposeful and meaningful. And I could talk at length about meaning.
Yeah. Well, and that was kind of the other thing that patients really got from it, was this sense of meaning and purpose, and this feeling that they were able to provide some value to other people. Because that's one of the things she talks about, that a lot of these terminally ill patients are kind of suffering from, is, they've been, quote, useful their whole life to someone, and then they're kind of in this state where they're not able to do a lot of the things that they've been able to do. And a lot of them feel just like they have no value if they're not able to be providing value to somebody else. Which is also something that gets brought up with a lot of senior citizens, is that, they can kind of suffer from depression, from feeling like they're not being of value to somebody. So this project kind of allowed them to feel like, hey, what I'm saying is going to help people, maybe help these students who are listening, maybe help some other people who are dying in the future who listen to this.
Yeah. It's like the end stages of Erik Erikson is another gold standard in social work school. But the stages of life and the very end stages, there's generativity versus stagnancy, or and then feeling like some satisfaction instead of despair. So the need to feel useful and like you've contributed something to other generations is really strong and really important. So it makes sense that right in this project here was an outlet for them to feel like they had something to contribute. I remember what stood out to me from that was one patient who was like, the idea of like, if I'm willing to undergo this very risky heart surgery, if I survive, then I'll be like the first one ever, and I will have contributed to medicine in that way.
Yeah.
Or if I don't survive, my body will have been used in the study of this process, right? So there's just this sense of having left behind something too, of oneself, even after you've passed.
Yeah, super important, that sense of meaning. There's also, on the point you mentioned something about like the patient oftentimes doesn't feel like they have control of what's happening to them. She talks about that as well, that I hope things are a little better now, but at least in the 60s when she was writing this, a lot of dying patients were not actually given much say as to how they would progress with their treatment. And she kind of says it's a bit of a myth to think. She said, at least in her findings, she never came across any dying patient who wanted things that were completely irrational. Like usually their wishes were very reasonable, but a lot of times maybe the family or the hospital staff was saying, no, like this is what we're going to do, and not really giving the dying person a say.
Yeah, a sense of agency, and autonomy. And it's a respect to their humanness and their dignity of being able to have things the way that they want, some sense of control over something, right? Just even like I think there was one patient in particular mentioned in the study that just really like needed some control over something, and the control over when visitors could come and when they could not, right? Just having like some area of of ownership and agency in his life as he was preparing to lose everything.
Totally. Huge. And again, that's another thing I think senior citizens often struggle with, is as they age and maybe lose some cognitive or physical abilities, they're just not able to do a lot of the same things. And especially men, self-care. It's hard for, I know that my grandpa just like, he should not have been driving for a long time, and he just like was not able to give that up. Just the kind of stubbornness of like, no, I'll be damned if you're going to drive me or if you're going to help me. And it's just like, just giving up that.
Well, even that is a form of denial, right? That's
and
when
anger,
anger, right? We start to see it just in like the slow decline of aging. I mean, I am certainly not in the category of senior citizen, but I, as a former dancer, I look back at what I used to be able to do physically, and I have been grieving and mourning the loss of my physical capacity for some of that dance. So this is applicable with the point I'm trying to make. It's not just to, say like, oh, I am like you guys and I'm in the same boat, but more so just that this is applicable in a wide way, because these stages of grief are not just for the dying, but can be also applicable for the loss and the change of anything along the hero's journey, the heroine's journey of life, because change is part of life. That's the only constant. And in my work also with clients who are of a big, broad range of ages, everybody experiences a little death in some way, through breakups, the ending of school and entering into adulthood. Right, adolescence is it's a huge like death metamorphosis process.
Death and rebirth. When you look at all of the kind of initiation rites, much of the symbolism revolves around the kind of death of the child and birth of the adult around adolescence. And so that's
grieving
kind of
your childhood, the loss of that, grieving. And especially as I'm working with, the last thing I'll say on that is when I do trauma work, right, a lot of times somebody has been living in their coping mechanisms, right, their denial or what their anger for a very long time, and then when they finally accept that something is in the past and that they can't change the past, that the healing can start, but there's also a lot of grief that comes along with that in recognizing how many years were lost to this trauma response, or how much time is lost. We grieve our own mortality even before we even get there.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's such a great point, and something to kind of, I think, be thinking about as we go through these stages. I was thinking we could start going through these a little bit. The 5 stages of grief, which the acronym I've heard is like DABDA. So DABDA. Yeah, that's right. So denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. So, and just kind of up top, I think you might have mentioned this earlier. She does mention here that these stages are not always necessarily linear.
That's right.
And often overlap or kind of come in cycles.
Mm-hmm. And can go back and forth. Like you can even start with depression, and you can find yourself in denial, and then you're in anger, and then you're back in denial again, and then you're depressed. Like you can dance around through all of them. And I would even say, yes, there's only 5. But that's probably not exhaustive. There's such a, we are such complex human beings, and there's such a nuance of feeling that can emerge out of this.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's good to kind of say that up front. It's kind of similar when I did a Piaget, his kind of models of the childhood development. It's similar kind of thing. It's like these models are very useful and helpful, but we also shouldn't get too married to the model and forget that,
right,
real life is a little more complicated.
Right. Every person's unique. Every person's journey is unique. And, we're only trying to describe something in generalities, and no one can really fully carve nature at its joints and predict, right?
Exactly.
That's our desire for control, right?
Exactly. Oh, great point. Exactly.
Yeah.
So denial, stage 1. She says almost every patient experiences denial. She says denial can last anywhere from a few seconds to many months. Mm-hmm. And it's usually a temporary stage that people move through, but she did talk about a few case studies of patients who pretty much maintain denial all the way up until death or near death.
Yeah. Yeah, the one that stands out to me was the story of the woman who put such bright, colorful makeup on to hide basically what was her deteriorating health, which was showing in her face and the coloring of her face. And she needed to maintain that semblance of everything is okay for herself.
And I think the other kind of denial tactic that she kind of used was she referred to her cancerous tumor, as a wound. So I thought that was very telling as well. The kind of she talks a little bit about like the euphemisms that somebody might use at this, where they're not actually able to kind of explicitly acknowledge death or explicitly acknowledge the tumor. They might use a euphemism.
Yeah, euphemisms is a big thing that is talked about in social work school as well. Because it's so common to our vernacular to say, oh, somebody passed away, or they're no longer with us. Right. They're gone for the big sleep. All of these euphemisms that are used to soften it for ourselves as we talk about it. However, the downside to euphemisms is it can be misinterpreted and misunderstood, especially by children. They think, oh, like, well, if grandpa's just sleeping, then he'll wake up. Yeah. Right. And if they went away, they'll come back. Right. There's that sort of idea of where did they go? Yeah. So the euphemism is our own culture's way of softening and creating some denial around the permanency and the pain. It's painful.
Yeah.
It's just pain, but can you blame us? I mean, who likes pain?
Right.
Suffering is everywhere. So these are just our natural ways of coping with something that is a very painful emotion. Same with the very cold clinical approach from the medical staff is they have to function in some way. If they were to really tap into their emotions and feel the pain with the patient to the extent that it would flood them too, then there's this fear that they wouldn't be able to do their job and be the objective lifeguard to the drowning person. Right.
And sometimes that can be exhibited by the doctor. Sometimes it's exhibited by the family member. There's actually a story. I actually teared up reading this. Some of this book was just so sad.
Yeah.
But maybe I'll just read this, and then we can kind of unpack what some of these different things that are going on. All right. So this is about a woman dying in her early 20s with 2 kids and a husband. So, quote, a discussion with the husband revealed a rather simple, unemotional man who seriously believed that his wife was better off living a short time at home with the children rather than having her suffering prolonged by hospitalizations, endless costs, and all the ups and downs of her chronic illness. He had little empathy with her and separated his feelings quite effectively from the context of his thoughts. He matter-of-factly related the impossibility of having a stable home environment with him working nights and the children living out during the week. Listening to him and placing ourselves into his position, we are able to appreciate that he could deal with the present life situation only in this detached manner. She, meaning the wife, became gradually weaker and for a couple of weeks just dozed and held our hand and did not speak much. After this, she became increasingly confused, was disoriented, and had delusions of a beautiful bedroom filled with fragrant flowers brought to her by her husband. Rejected by her family, often overlooked or ignored by the hospital personnel, she became a pitiful figure, a disheveled-looking woman who sat desperately lonely on the edge of her bed, clutching the telephone to hear a sound. She found temporary refuge in delusions of beauty, flowers, and loving care which she could not obtain in real life. She did not have a sound religious background to help her through this crisis and required weeks and months of often silent companionship to help her finally accept her death without suicide and without psychosis. So really, really heavy stuff.
Yeah.
But I think that story, I think one of the nice things about this book is that she includes these longer stories to kind of really let us get the human element of this. But there are a few examples that we're kind of talking about of the denial stage. So the denial of the husband was to just completely detach emotionally and just be completely cold and, like not caring to her because he just couldn't deal with it any other way. So that was the kind of denial on his part. And then the denial on the part of the woman, which was so sad. She's having these like delusions and fantasies of actually thinking that her room is full of flowers brought to her by her husband when in fact he
wasn't doing anything.
There.
Yeah. Well, and that just, if anything, when I hear that, yes, I'm sad for her because she didn't have that kind of support that she really wanted. And yet I'm also in awe at the resilience of the human spirit and our own psyches and our abilities to create these very creative coping mechanisms, because that's what fantasy is. It's yes, we could pathologize fantasy because you're right. It's you hear that word delusion, it has so much pathology attached to it. And it's true that there are some negative consequences to living in a fantasy world. And at the same time, why do we even have it in the first place? It's this ability to imagine things is something inborn in us since childhood. And it's a way of creating an escape or helping ourselves cope when the reality is far too painful to face in the full front of it. It's too abrasive. The fantasy creates a necessary place to escape to. Yeah,
a bit of distance in that initial shock. And she seems to be, she says like denial is totally natural and serves that function, like it serves a useful function. And she's very big on like, you don't want to force this isn't like ripping off a band-aid. If the person has signaled that they're not ready to accept it, you can do some damage by kind of trying to move them along too fast. So
absolutely,
part of what the chaplain or the doctor or the loved one should be doing ideally is listening for those cues and then
of their readiness
to move on to the next stage. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, I'm so glad you say that, because it's for the outsider, right? This is again like information for the people in proximity to the person who is going through this and facing this incredible pain of their own death. And I worked in drug treatment in addiction recovery treatment for 3 years. And, in those kinds of spaces, right, denial is something that comes up a lot. And in terms of recovery, it's seen as the very first stage for change, that you have to admit that you have a problem. And the longer you deny, the longer you prolong your own healing process, right? And that, just to use that as a parallel experience here, that again, it comes down to control, right? We don't want to admit that we don't have control over something. And so I'm speaking the we, but it would be like if it were if I were the one who was dealing with an addiction issue, for example, I wouldn't want to admit that I don't have control over this thing that's much bigger than me. And I try to hold on to trying to manage it for as long as possible. And or like keep my fantasy world that I can still do this thing that's actually hurting me long term. So there's a lot of stigma that's placed on that word denial, I think, because of recovery, the culture around recovery, that denial can hurt other people because the longer somebody is stuck in their addiction, the codependents, the people in proximity to that person can also be, really taken along for the ride and hurt when the person is refusing to get help and admit that this is something beyond their control that they actually need outside interventions for.
Right.
So similarly, right, like your story about your grandfather, like not wanting to give up driving, not wanting to admit that maybe they need outside intervention, outside help to be someone to drive them, right? Yeah. Or I need actual medical attention. I need outside help for this. This is not something I can just like slap a Band-Aid on and heal on my own. And so there's this like really, the reason denial is there is that it takes time for the person to really prepare and face the very humbling fact that they don't have control over something and that they need help.
Right. Right.
And they're heading towards something that's much bigger than anything that they can manage on their own.
Yeah, I love that kind of mapping this onto, what is it, the 12 stages of the kind of
12 steps
program.
Yeah.
Because the first step of the 12-step program is admitting you're powerless. It's a form of acceptance. So it's kind of not funny, but like amusing that the first stage of that is kind of like the last stage of the grief process.
Right.
So there's kind of a journey even leading up to step one in that journey.
Yeah. And that, like, because earlier we were talking about how death is and change, right? The end of one life and the beginning of a new life is something that happens throughout our entire lifetimes, like adolescence, right? And in this case, like somebody who is facing recovery is having to admit like the death of the way that things were, that's no longer working, in order to cross this threshold experience, in order to rebirth themselves into their new life of recovery, if they're ready for it, if they're ready to cross. Yeah, that's
great. And maybe just one or two other of these kind of examples that kind of demonstrate denial. One thing that Kubler-Ross says was really common was pretty much everybody, when they first got the diagnosis, said like, no, that's not true. Like, no way, that couldn't be me. Or maybe you mixed up my files with somebody else. A lot of them wanting to get a second opinion. This is all, that's also all very common.
Right. That's the thread of hope, right?
Yeah, the thread of hope.
Denial and hope kind of work together very much. They're like buddies.
Yeah.
Because is in some way, the denial is moving away from accepting something that would be feels intolerable to accept until someone's actually ready. And that denial part will lean into the part of the part of you that's always hopeful. Hopeful for life. So they're kind of, I don't want to say colluding, but they're like working together as a team.
Absolutely.
In order to keep the person in a place at enough distance from the reality for them to ready themselves and cope and prepare.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I was even thinking maybe this is a different point completely, but it made me think of like, and you watch the movie and like a woman takes a pregnancy test, then she finds out she's pregnant. It's unexpected. Like, what does she do? She always takes like 10 more.
Yeah. Yeah.
Whereas I think if you take a negative pregnancy test, you're probably like, oh, I'm not pregnant. Like, you're probably not going to take 10 more. So I think there is that. There
depends
is that,
on your goals. Yeah.
Maybe, yeah. But I think there is that kind of like, I maybe don't want this to be true, or I'm in shock, not expecting this to be true. So I'm going to like retest this like 10 times.
Yeah. And that's where we get into like the nuances, right? That, like I said earlier, there aren't just like 5 stages. I think denial encompasses also feelings of shock.
Yeah. And, shock is definitely in there.
And numbness, right? Because sometimes in the face of shock, we actually freeze up and there's no feelings at all. So the feeling of being totally numb in that frozen state is also a form of denial, because your system is just arrested and refusing to move forward in time, because they're like, well, if I pause here, maybe it'll go away. Right. That's like the frozen playing possum, like the body. This is one of the survival, flight, fight, freeze, appease responses. Like a possum that freezes up. It's just like, if I'm really still, maybe this threat that this news will just go away.
Which, that's I was going to mention shock, because that's maybe like a sub stage within this denial. And also
that's a more like passive versus an active denial. Go ahead.
Well, and then they also talk about a little tiny bit about isolation in this stage. And I would have loved for her to elaborate more on this. She really doesn't say much about it. But in the quote by Tagore at the beginning is, man barricades against himself. And I'm wondering if that's a certain coping mechanism or state, or behavior of denial, which is like, I'm just going to isolate myself from everybody so I don't have to deal with this, or so I don't have to really like look at this.
Look at it. Yeah. People are our mirrors. So like I was saying earlier, our existence, our sense of self and our sense of existence is often dependent on others reflecting that back to us, bearing witness to us, right? As we ventilate, as someone bears witness, we get a sense that we exist. And through that, other people also are our mirrors reflecting back our reality, right? So like someone sees you and they're like, oh God, you look terrible. And you're like, do I? Like someone is literally being your mirror by telling you how you look. Right, and so, so this,
and if you're, oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say like, if you, are diagnosed with a terminal illness and you're around other people, they're all going to be sad and treating you differently, and like that
in these ways
it makes it a lot harder to deny when you're getting that feedback. That's exactly, that's great. Yeah,
they're reflecting the reality back to you, and denial is not wanting to look in the mirror. So if other people are your mirrors, you're not going to want to look into that mirror either. And the isolation, the self-isolation, the barricading and the hermiting is a way to avoid having to look in.
That's so great. I'm glad you brought that up, because I was kind of a little puzzled how that piece fits in there, but I think that's spot on. Well, maybe we can go on to stage 2. So anger.
Okay. Yeah. Again, lots of nuances around anger, because I think there's, different ways that we direct that anger when we're in such a stage. Like she talks a lot about directing that anger at God.
Yeah.
That's a big one. Because this is again, right, about the loss of control, or the shattering of that illusion of control that we all maintain a steady degree of denial as we move through our lives a little bit with. So, this God force, however you conceive of God, I'm using 12-step language here too, is something that symbolizes that which is greater than us, beyond control. Yeah. And so when you're facing something like death, which falls into that category, the the natural like place to turn your attention and fingers of blame towards is, well, who did this? And sometimes that finger gets pointed up at the God force, however you conceive of that. Can, there's a lot of like outward directed anger in the form of blame, of wanting to, again, to bring a sense of control. If we can understand what caused something, it gives us some kind of comfort that at least we know, okay, if this thing caused it, well, then that's what I need to focus my attention on to fix this.
Right. She says the question that preoccupies people in this stage is, why me?
Right. Well, and that's the other way the finger gets pointed. If you're not pointing your angry finger of blame at God or the doctor who told you, right? It's their fault that they're not practicing medicine correctly and they gave me this incorrect diagnosis and I need to, so if that's the cause, I need to go to a different doctor, right? Or anger at the staff that's not treating you in the way that you want. Those are all outward pointing fingers of blame and of anger. And then the other way anger gets directed is inward at the self, right? Which is, again, another way to find control. Because if it's not out here, that's the cause. Well, then why me? I must be, it's all my fault. And there's this also anger that you're being the victim at the same time.
Well, and it goes back to what we were talking about of wanting to maintain the belief that this was in your control or somebody else's control. That like, had I just done X, Y, and Z, this never would have happened. And I think that it makes me think of like the book of Job, where Job he's suffering, he's dying in some sense, and he's asking that question, why me? And he is pointing his anger at God, saying like, look, I didn't do anything to deserve this. So it kind of starts with that presupposition that, people get sick because they did something wrong, or they could have done something differently. There's kind of that's baked into it, I think.
Yeah.
And that can cause the frustration of like, I did everything right.
Right. I ate all my kale and I did
according to my kind of conceptions of justice, like this is unjust.
Yes. Well, and I think because of modern medical advances again, and because we have a society that has embraced a lot of, healthful trends of ways to like prolong one's life and one's health, we fall into that false illusion of control. And Susan Sontag writes about this. The title of the book escapes me, but she authored many novels, and one was about her battle with breast cancer, and how in being the person who is sick, right, who's been diagnosed, there's a lot of blame that happens, either self-blame or even like insinuated from other people that what did you do to get cancer? Like you must live a lifestyle that's way too stressful, so your body is fighting itself. Like there become all of these like sort of almost moralistic, like moral judgment explanations as to like what caused you to be diagnosed and to be terminal.
Yeah.
And frankly, like it's not that simple, and we can't, make these assumptions. But if we want to empathize and understand where it comes from this loss of control. We want to explain with cause and effect. And if we can identify the cause, and if we can eradicate the cause, well, then we can eliminate the effect, which is the death. Right.
No, I think you hit the nail on the head.
Right. Well, and if it's me, like if I'm the cause, well, if I just change myself, then that'll fix it. And then I won't have to die. And then we head into the bargaining territory a little there. Yeah.
No, I feel like we should just go there since we're already kind of...
Oh, before we do, though, I do want to speak to the other thing of anger that she mentioned was jealousy, right? So see how anger can be about, directing your blame or shame towards someone, either yourself, you feel shameful that you did these things, or you're blaming someone for doing it to you. Or it can also be jealousy. She is mentioning that anger can also be about compare and despair, where you are comparing your situation to the living.
Yeah.
And are like, wow, look at them, how lucky. They don't have to deal with this that I'm suffering from so greatly right now. And the jealousy for those who get to still enjoy their life for years more.
Well, yeah. And it's more of that same kind of like, maybe by that own person's conception of justice, just like, hey, I did everything right and this is happening to me, and look at her, she's, you know, smoking a pack a day or whatever the thing is, and like she gets to live. Like, that's not fair. Like,
exactly.
So it's kind of creates that, like you said, jealousy, anger towards, she calls it like jealousy towards the healthy or the young.
Right, the envy.
Yeah.
So then you start to bargain.
Yeah. So then you start to bargain,
because you have this idea. Oh, if I could do this, if I could do what they're doing, maybe then I'll.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's the bargaining piece comes in, which is this stage 3. So let me read this quote here. Bargaining is helpful to the patient, though only for brief periods of time. If we have been unable to face the sad facts in the first period and have been angry at people and God in the second phase, maybe we can succeed in entering into some sort of an agreement which may postpone the inevitable happening.
Can I jump into some thoughts here?
Please.
So if we want to also continue that like parallel process of comparing death to any change process, in any change process, there are these moments of ambivalence where you're like ready, but not ready, right? And this is all like kind of the dance, but your ambivalence means to ambulate, to walk between two by truths. That's the valence. So you're walking between two truths and you're, deciding on your readiness to, pick one, because in the ambivalent state, you're still in a limbo phase.
But she does call it like a partial acceptance.
Yes.
Because when you're in the bargaining stage, you're at least acknowledging, hey, I do, have cancer or whatever the thing is, but there's still that denial comes in. But maybe if I do this, this, and this, so yeah, there's that. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
You're right. Yeah. Right. If I do this, this, and this, maybe I don't have to go there.
Yeah.
Or maybe I can have a little bit of this cake and eat it too. That I can still maintain some of my old way of doing things. Or I think bargaining can be a bit of like walking two worlds at once and trying to have both. And it can also be a way of almost like bartering for more time. You're gonna sacrifice this thing, like, okay, like I'll do anything if you can give me a little more time. Like, and this is aimed at God usually, or it might be aimed at the medical professional.
I think she says usually aimed at God, and a lot of times not even said out loud, just kind of in that person's thought process.
Yeah,
this is occurring.
Right. Like if I'm real good and I go and I attend and I say all of my apologies to all the people that I've wronged. Maybe I could get a little more time to do that. And then if I'm still good, right, for good behavior, I'd really like to attend my son's wedding before.
Yeah, that was one of the examples. Well, and that was
before I go. So if you could just give me a little more time, then that's it. That's the only thing I'll ask for, right? And then I accept, right, that this is my fate.
Yeah, the example was this woman who was dying. Her son was about to get married, and that was the kind of bargain. Like if I good and do my chemo, do everything right, like I just want to be able to live to see my son's wedding day. And this was, she says, quote, she had made all sorts of promises if she could only live long enough to attend this marriage. The day preceding the wedding, she left the hospital as an elegant lady. She was the happiest person in the world and looked radiant. I will never forget the moment when she returned to the hospital. She looked tired and somewhat exhausted. Before I could say hello, she said, now don't forget, I have another son. And, you know, it's kind of
right.
kind of funny, but the point that she's making there is pretty much any time if the person is kind of like awarded this thing that they want, they're pretty much always gonna like want something else or
more.
kind of renege on the agreement. And she kind of compares it to, at one point, a child asking to go to a sleepover, and the child is saying, like, the child is initially told no, and then the child kind of comes back with, well, okay, but if I never fight with my sister ever again, then can I go? And, you know, then the child is allowed to go to the sleepover, and then she kind of says, but of course the child is then going to fight with the sister at some future time. So the quote agreement isn't really kept, I guess, is I think the point.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing we have to remember, right? When you're facing death and you're feeling those feelings of helplessness and the loss of control, well, those are all things, the helplessness and the loss of control is all reminiscent of being a child. And we're all reduced to our own, you know, inner child states when we're facing helpless circumstances. That's kind of natural, that comes out. And so, you know, this is something innate in all of us, that in a place of sheer desperateness, when we are facing absolute threat to our lives, in this case, that's what's happening. We will do anything to survive. The system will do anything to survive.
Yeah.
And we're also, right, there's no, at that point, right, there's sometimes no forethought into the consequences of that or how that will affect other people, because there's no time for that. It's just about like alleviating the life-threatening situation, which is right here and now. And I think for those in proximity to the dying person, sometimes, you know, we can cast, like and I'm saying this because maybe I'm feeling parts of myself that come up around this. You can cast harsh judgment on somebody for making promises they can't keep, or right, or like even just that denial word, right? Like, oh, like, what's wrong with you? Just accept it. Like that kind of thing. Like there's this sort of like criticism and judgment that can be hurled towards somebody for being in these stages. Oh, you're so bitter and angry. You're so annoying. I don't want to be around you. Right. So those kinds of judgments and criticisms really get in the way of our own hearts, opening up to the person who is experiencing something really profound. This is a threshold experience, and they have every right to feel whatever they want to feel. Yeah. And so not to take it personally, I think is important, that when they're making these promises that, you know, a doctor might be like, well, they're just trying to be manipulative. They're just trying to see whatever, they're bargaining to see whatever they can get, right? There's that judgment in there, but it's like, well, you would too, of course, if you were the one hanging off the edge of a cliff.
Totally. And she talks about how if all of the person's loved ones are taking their anger personally, then it can create more anger and can kind of create these like nasty feedback loops. Right. So,
or taking the bargaining personally, like,
exactly. Or literally
like taking advantage of me, right? Like that's sort of, you can't hold somebody to that standard, the same standard as yourself, who's the one who's still living without this imminent death.
The loved ones, they're going through their own 5 stages. A lot of, you know, I think, which we'll kind of get to as well, that these stages map onto them, kind of like how we talked about earlier. So they could be, you know, there's oftentimes a mismatch. Maybe we can move on to stage 4. Okay. Yeah. So stage 4 is depression. There are 2 different types of depression that she kind of distinguished. So we have reactive depression, and then preparatory depression. So my understanding was reactive depression is mourning losses that have already occurred. So like in the case of a terminally ill patient, they might have already lost their ability to do certain things. They might have already lost their ability to, you know, watch their kids after school or play with their kids. So that's reactive depression. And then preparatory depression is looking forward to their eventual death and mourning, pretty much the loss of everything. And she says that we should kind of think about these two types differently and also respond to them differently. And that oftentimes the reactive depression, it can be very useful to somebody who's comforting somebody who is experiencing reactive depression to kind of be optimistic and comforting and saying, oh, actually, like your children have been coming over, staying at my house after school, and they've been really adjusting well. Like that can be comforting. But she says what often happens is we try to kind of be super cheerful and optimistic and say, hey, don't be so sad when it comes to preparatory depression. And she's saying like that's not useful. And that the person actually is going to lose everything, and they need to be able to kind of express those feelings of sad and grief around somebody who is not going to kind of tell them to put on a happy face.
Right. Yeah. The silver lining, always, right? That's, this is a good, I think, in line with the theme of what we were just talking about, which is the things that get in the way of us really empathizing with the dying person, which is, our own discomfort. And when somebody's in that depression, right, our discomfort with their sadness is what makes us want to say, oh, cheer up, right? Telling them to cheer up because we can't tolerate their depression. And that actually, right, it doesn't help because one, you feel what you feel. You can't help feeling what you feel. And you can't just, I think, there's an expression that hopefully doesn't get passed down to next generations, but where adults would sometimes say, oh, well, when you're crying, go fix your face, right? This idea that you can somehow change your feelings and not feel what you're feeling is false. And the person who's feeling that way now gets a second arrow. The first arrow is the depression that they're experiencing, they're suffering. And then the second arrow there is that now I feel bad that I'm depressed. Yeah. Now I'm feeling shamed that I'm depressed because of how other people are mirroring this back to me.
Totally. So, yeah. No, that's a great, it just kind of compounds the suffering.
Right.
Yeah. And maybe a few kind of quotes here. She says, quote, this type of depression, speaking about the preparatory depression, is necessary and beneficial if the patient is to die in a stage of acceptance and peace. Only patients who have been able to work through their anguish and anxieties are able to achieve this stage.
Yeah, and when she distinguishes between preparatory depression versus reactive depression, from what I interpret from that is that she's talking about how when we're grieving change, any change, there's always a loss when it comes to change, the loss of the old way to embrace the new, to cross that threshold, right? So we're going to have grief for what was lost, and that's the reactive depression. But then there's also a grief that has to happen for what was your projected future. You know, the idea of I'm going to use a breakup for an example, right? Because that's also a death in a relationship. And so there's the grief for the relationship having broken up and the loss of the person. But then there also is this sort of anticipatory grief where you're anticipating that in the coming year, I'm going to have to face all of these seasons, all these seasonal markers without my person. So I'm going to go through the holidays, and last year we did this, and I'm going to come upon those holidays and they're not going to be with me for that particular thing. Right. And then come springtime, it's going to be our anniversary, and I'm going to remember that a year ago we were celebrating this, and this year they're gone. Right. So there's this sort of like anticipation of what you will have to grieve in the coming future, and then even the hypothetical timelines that you created of the life you hope to live, right? The dream of maybe having a family together, that now that dream is lost. Or same goes with grieving the end of a career or retirement, or if you're changing careers, right? You're not going to be that thing you imagined yourself to be.
Yeah.
And so there's this like grief of reacting to the present and the past. And then there's this preparatory grief for, in the case of the dying person, of what they will have to now face now that this is in fact true and happening, of, okay, I won't be able to spend more time with my grandkids other than this limited window. I'm not going to have time to go travel the world like I had wanted to. Right. There's this sort of anticipatory grief of then like, what will it be like to get my affairs in order and actually like give my possessions away if I have to witness that. So grieving all of these things in the future, and then not just like actual future timeline, but also the loss of hypothetical timelines that will never be because of this pivotal change.
Yeah. And even like as you were talking, I was just thinking how all of these stages are kind of leading towards acceptance. And this stage, you can already see and kind of sense how the unpleasant truth has kind of set in, or the reality has set in, I should say.
Yeah.
You know, this is like stage 4 of 5. And we a lot of times think of depression as, again, like kind of like an earlier stage. There's an episode of The Office where Michael Scott says something about he's trying to like move his coworkers through these 5 stages of grief, and he said the line is something like, you know, if I can get them to depression by lunchtime, we'll be in good shape. And it's right. It's kind of funny, or not funny, but just like ironic to be thinking about it as this way, because we often, I think of sadness or depression as kind of like the beginning, but it can be,
right?
Yeah,
because these are not nonlinear, and so it certainly can be.
But I guess my point is, I think for me, just it kind of highlights the fact that like when somebody is feeling really sad, that is likely was preceded by several steps leading up to it. Yeah.
Yes, right, exactly. There's and then when people do the thing that she talks about, which is the silver lining, where they try to say, cheer up, right? They're reintroducing denial right back, right?
Yeah.
So really, like, I think like if there's any like simplistic, like, could I explain to a 6-year-old takeaway from this in terms of relating to others who are going through a tremendous change? Or I would say for anybody who's being the witness, who's bearing witness and holding that space with somebody, is to just be with them in whatever stage they're in. Yeah, be with them and I'm depressed. Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah, you're right. Tell me what that's like. Tell me what it's like. There's a wonderful Brene Brown talk, and then was turned into like a cartoon video on YouTube of where I love how the illustrator depicted this, where when you're being with someone, when you're empathizing with somebody, it's like climbing down into the dark hole with them and sitting in there with them. So if somebody's in that dark hole of depression, you don't have to let their depression flood you. Like, again, like the separation is important because you want to maintain separation as the witness and the lifeguard from the person who's drowning in order to help them the best. Otherwise, you're just drowning too. But you do want to join them in the water, and you want to get into that water and have some understanding through their communication, through their verbal ventilation and expression of what it's like to be down here. And rather than trying to pull away from that, just sitting in it.
Yeah.
And by your courage to sit in that emotion with them, that just that simple thing of sitting in that with them gives the other person the reassurance that, yeah, and it's okay to feel this. Because if they can sit with me in it, that's the mirroring. If they can sit with me in this, then it must be okay to be here and feel this way.
Yeah,
it's so validating.
That's great. And she talks about that a lot. That a lot of times the best thing that you can do for somebody is to just sit with them in silence, or hold their hand, or just kind of be present or available. Like, they might actually want to be alone, but knowing that if they do want somebody with them that you're like one call away. I think that's a big message. And that also, we're kind of getting into the acceptance stage already, which
right, because depression is not sugarcoating it anymore.
Right. In the acceptance stage, she says a lot of times the dying person does kind of want to be left alone. They're starting to really disconnect, but not disconnect in the kind of like denial, like I'm just going to not acknowledge this. Disconnect in that they're kind of starting to unplug from the world. They're starting to tune out television, what's going on in the news. Right. They're wanting to hear less about, the latest gossip. They're starting to want to see less and less visitors.
Right. Healthy separation from family relations. Yeah.
And that can be, she says this can be like a really hard part on the loved ones, because they can like again take this personally, feel it as a rejection of them. And then there's also, like, we've kind of talked about this battle between like hope and acceptance. Sometimes that can get compounded where the dying person is accepted their death and they're ready to die, and maybe their loved one isn't, and can, like you mentioned earlier, kind of make them feel bad about that, of kind of like, you're giving up or you're quitting. So, and she says, like, this is definitely not useful or helpful for the dying person,
right?
When it's kind of framed this way. They've kind of reached this acceptance and are ready to die, but I think there's one example where like the husband wasn't ready to let go, and he's just like, this is unacceptable. Like she can't die, she can't quit.
Right.
And
or
she
like
says,
we said earlier, the doctor's saying, don't quit on me, right?
Yeah. Right. And that kind of, I think, again, speaks to our kind of macho culture of just like, come on, man, like one more push up, don't give up.
Right.
So I think what is radical about this book is viewing acceptance as a natural thing, and maybe I'll even say good thing.
Yeah. As you're saying this, I'm just I think it's so appropriate you say it's macho culture. It's if we want to frame it in terms of yin and yang and like divine masculine, divine feminine energies, right? Our culture is very much in applauds the sort of masculine energy, and this is not having to do with gender, but more so just the way we conceive of these differing energies, but the masculine energy of productivity, of like things are always progressing, things are always improving, and growth, and my bank account must always be collecting interest and growing, right? We never want to see anything of decline. We shun decline. Everything has to be this like linear thing. And whereas so the feminine energy celebrates these cycles and these returns back to the beginning. So and we need both, to be honest, right? Like when we wake up in the morning with the sun is associated with the masculine, right? Like in Greek mythology, that's Apollo. And we get up and the sunlight like invigorates us, and we go out and we do our day, and we're like accomplishing things, and we don't give up. We persevere, and we express our vitality. And then at the end of the day, when the sun sets and we get into the night, the darkness, right? Death is about darkness. It's facing that great sleep, the great dark. And that's like the yin, divine feminine energy. And at nighttime, we come back to our homes and we restore, and we return back to these like, childlike needs of being held, connecting relationally with loved ones, nurturing ourselves, like creating almost like a womb space. Our home space is supposed to be cozy. It's like our little womb to go back to. Yeah,
and she talks a lot about that, kind of how similar the very end of life is to the very beginning of life. And the patient is oftentimes, or not even just patient, the dying person is oftentimes spending a lot of time sleeping, a lot of time by themselves.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is Right. Beautiful. It's in maybe solitude, reflection of, sometimes it's not just about having validation with the other people. Yes, other people are our supports and our mirrors, but we also need to commune with ourselves. And so often, like when we talk about someone going on a spiritual journey, it's something that has to be set out alone, because you need to tune out the voices of others in order to hear the voices within, and then however you conceive spiritually of your supports through divine entities. So this is a major threshold crossing, and sometimes you have to commune with your own ancestors. And there's been, I remember when my grandmother was dying, she was not making sense. She was speaking in word salad a lot, and sometimes she would mention the names of all of these people who had died, and like it was thought, we were thinking, oh, she's probably talking to them, because the veil between worlds is very thin as you approach, as you start to approach. And this is also now starting to verge into where spirituality comes into play, because everyone has different cultural spiritual beliefs, but it's really common that my mother used to be a nurse, and she worked in with nursing care patients, and she said the same thing, that they would just be like in their beds tossing and turning and saying Ruth, Edith, like talking to different people that are no longer living. And so there is this sort of like phenomenon that like the reason that there is this separation in the acceptance stage from the realm of the living is because they're like actually starting to commune with the other side is what's thought. Or there's a need to commune with oneself, and just like have some self time with this mortal corporal body before you leave it behind. That's why there's also the loss of desire to eat. As you start to kind of pull away from those things in what's a necessary stage. And that gets very terrifying for us who are, in this sort of idea of everything must be progressive and getting better, for us to then like turn and accept actually this decline, like the cycles of the year, another feminine cycle. The leaves have to fall off the tree. The world needs to go into winter and die. And so does each person.
That's beautiful. I love it.
Oh, thank you. Thank
wow. No, that's so great. Well, I was thinking, we're kind of wrapping up. I was thinking of reading just this last paragraph of the book. She kind of lets herself go a little more literary here at the end. And I think she kind of summarizes a lot of her views on death and dying. She says, quote, "Those who have the strength and the love to sit with a dying patient in the silence that goes beyond words will know that this moment is neither frightening nor painful, but a peaceful cessation of the functioning of the body. Watching a peaceful death on a human being reminds us of a falling star, one of a million lights in a vast sky that flares up for a brief moment only to disappear into the endless night forever. To be a therapist to the dying patient makes us aware of the uniqueness of each individual in the vast sea of humanity. It makes us aware of our finiteness, our limited lifespan. Few of us live beyond our 70 years, and yet in that brief time, most of us create and live a unique biography and weave ourselves into the fabric of human history."
It's beautiful.
Yeah, I thought that was really, really great.
Yeah. Well, I feel like I don't even want to follow
I don't
up
even
those
want to
words.
touch that. Maybe we can just end it there. This was so great.
Yeah. Likewise.
Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you for inviting me. This has been a real pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Unpacking Ideas. If you enjoyed the episode, please scroll down and write us a review or give us a rating. I know that takes a little bit of effort, but it really helps with the algorithm so that more people can discover the show. So thanks for doing that in advance. If you'd like to get in touch with me or to hear about what's coming up next on the podcast, visit unpackingideas.com/podcast. And there I provide links to articles and essays and books that we'll be discussing on future podcast episodes. And finally, if you would like to hear more from Andrea, check her out on Psychology Today. I'll provide the link in the show notes, and there you can see what she's up to, as well as read about some of her information on internal family systems. So definitely check out Andrea. All right, guys, that's going to do it for today. Thanks so much for listening, and I will see you next episode.